Spider-Man. There are some places on Earth that seem to be magnets for tragedy or repositories of bad luck and evil. Other places are wellsprings of good fortune. On the dark side, think the Bermuda Triangle, Sand Creek, the Trump White House. On the bright side, think the Mercury Cafe in Denver, or that place you met your soulmate. This story is about a somewhat malevolent place in Denver that eventually gave birth to circumstances that led to love. On January 24th, 2003, a Cessna 172 Skylark, on its way to Wyoming, collided with a twin-engine Piper Cheyenne that was en route to Centennial in Colorado. The Cessna wound up landing almost eerily intact, albeit with 2 dead on board, in a backyard a few blocks south of where on Moncrief Place in northeast West Denver, the larger Piper Cheyenne crashed into a home that burst into flames, killing all 3 young men on board, one of whom, sadly enough, had survived the Columbine massacre 4 years earlier. A tragedy for sure. Strangely, on the lot adjacent to where the Piper Cheyenne crashed sits another house that was home to an even more bizarre tragedy that took place in 1941. Coincidentally, a sad story that has dovetailed into my wife Marcia's family lore. In 1891, a young accountant, Philip Peters, and his wife Helen moved into a modest brick bungalow at 3351 West Moncrief Place in Denver. The outgoing, generous, and entertaining couple lived there for the next 50 years, during which time they offered their hospitality to family and friends, and even to strangers. They were music lovers and founded the West Denver Mandolin Society, as mandolins were all the rage at the turn of the century. Helen and Philip kindly offered their home for society meetings and practice sessions. They were especially benevolent to one Theodore Conies, a musician whom, a decade earlier, they had hosted as a teenager when Theodore was traveling from Indiana to California with his high school band for a music competition. Conies was a debonair, although impoverished mandolin instructor who conducted classes in the Peters living room during his time as a member of the West Denver Mandolin Society. Out of the goodness of their hearts, Helen and Philip fed the undernourished Conies dinner off and on during their tenure with the Mandolin Society, until Conies drifted away from Denver in 1912. Fast forward almost 30 years. In the autumn of 1941, Helen was hospitalized with a broken hip. Her stay in the hospital was lengthy. Because the now elderly Mr. Peters was alone, neighbors on Moncrief Place invited 73-year-old Philip to to take supper with them during Helen's hospital stay, as cooking for himself was not something Mr. Peters had ever done. When he failed to show one night for dinner, and then failed to answer their knock at his front door, the neighbors, concerned that Mr. Peters might have had a stroke, had their youngest daughter crawl into the house through an unlocked kitchen window, where she was terrorized to discover the body of Mr. Peters. He had been bludgeoned dozens of times with a cast iron stove shaker. Arriving police after their search were exceedingly puzzled, as they found neither the killer nor any clues to the murderer's identity. Robbery was ruled out. Especially odd it was that all of the outer doors to the home were locked. Over the course of the next few months, the murder case remained unsolved. During that time, housekeepers whom Helen hired after she was released from the hospital quit, one after the other, referencing a ghostly presence, strange odors, and recurring weird noises. Helen alerted the police again and again to the strange things afoot in her home, and the police conducted additional fruitless searches. Helen, at wit's end and unsure what to do, approached my wife Marcia's great Aunt Mary, her good friend who lived across the street. Now, visiting Mary at the time from Wyoming were her brother Frank and his teenage son Russell, my wife's grandfather and father. Over a lunch of cherry kuchen, Russell's favorite, and chicken soup, Helen told Mary, Frank, and Russell of her suspicions, mentioning her housekeeper's observations. Helen went on to claim that on more than one occasion, she found the refrigerator door ajar. A half a quart of milk had turned into a half a cup of milk. She recounted a litany of food disappearances. She remarked that there were strange smells as well. And sometimes, Helen arrived home from shopping and would find the rocking chair a-rocking. The ever-practical and skeptical Wyomingite, Frank, rolled his eyes and winked at his son, an indication that he thought Mr. Peters' tragic death had warped Helen's logical thinking. After lunch, Helen asked Frank and Russell if they would take a serious look around her house. And my wife's father and grandfather did search every room of Helen's home, including the cellar. The father and son conducted what they felt was a thorough search, as had the police on more than one occasion. And like the police, Frank and Russell came up with nothing. Helen was so bewildered by the months-long, unproductive investigation of her husband's murder and her intuition that something was amiss at 3351 Moncrief Place, that she moved to Grand Junction to live with her son. The house remained unoccupied, or was it? by the neighbors' stories of footprints in the snow heading towards the kitchen window, and reports of occasional music and faint night lights emanating from the house, the police reluctantly, yet dutifully, set up covert surveillance in Marcia's great Aunt Mary's shrubbery across from Helen's deserted house. And soon their persistence was rewarded when an officer glimpsed a face in the window as a curtain was briefly pulled back. The police raced into the house and saw a small door swinging shut across the top of the landing. And inside was a closet where they found a narrow opening through which one Theodore Coneys was attempting to ascend. The police grabbed the 2 feet that were attached to an emaciated, disheveled, and exceedingly stinky 75-pound man who came to be known as Spider-Man, a moniker having to do with the cobweb-infested mini-attic where Connie had apparently lived. To quote an investigative detective,
"A man would have to be a spider to stand it long up there."
The stench in Coney's makeshift abode was so putrid and foul that one of the detectives actually fainted. No surprise it was that Theodore Coneys immediately became the prime suspect in the murder of Philip Peters 9 months before. A crime that Coneys admitted the very night of his capture, although he claimed self-defense, stating,
"It was him or me. Hell, Peters, he had a weapon."
as Philip was carrying a blackthorn cane he carried. At his trial that ended in conviction, Coney spun a tale of poverty and homelessness that led him back to Denver in 1941, after his departure from Denver in 1912. The Great War years and the Great Depression had not been kind. A drifter, he spent years hoboing and working as an itinerant laborer. Eventually, back in Denver, where he'd known better times, Coneys had hoped his old benefactors from his mandolin society days would give him a loan. Thus, he went to visit Philip and Helen, but finding no one home and the front door unlocked, he went in to steal some food. Knowing of the mini attic space from his stay on Moncrief Place 40 years before, Coneys secretly lodged himself there. He pilfered food at night while Helen and Philip slept. Sadly, Mr. Peters, alone with Helen in the hospital, had come across him one night at the refrigerator. And Coneys killed him. With nowhere to go, Coneys stayed after murdering Mr. Peters, even as the police searched the house the night of the murder. He was there when Russell and Frank searched as well. Until July of 1942, he remained while Helen lived there alone, and when she moved to Grand Junction. He was there when Russell and Frank searched as well. He drank water from radiators and from the hot water heater, and he ate jarred jam he found in the cellar. He had even re-rigged the house wiring and electrified a radio and some lights. Hence, the occasional lights and music and the noise of static emanating from what the Moncrief Place kids called the haunted house. was sentenced to life in prison in the Colorado State Penitentiary, where he died in 1966. About the time my wife Marcia took up roller skating on the sidewalk in front of Spider-Man's abode while visiting her great Aunt Mary. Fortunately, Marcia so loved her visits with her great Aunt Mary that she vowed to herself that she'd leave small-town Torrington, Wyoming one day and make big city Denver her home. Lucky for me, she made good on her promise, as Marcia eventually moved to Denver, where we met and fell in love. So Moncrief Place turned out to be not so bad after all.